good morning.
Good morning.
How was your last night? Everything is great? Perfect, amazing. So thank you again for joining us on this second day of the conference. I hope you all had a chance to explore the city last night, and those who did the walking tour, I hope you guys had fun with Cheyenne. So today, we have our pleasure to have Dr. Lilian CHEE here to be our first plenary speaker for the day. So I would like to introduce myself first. I'm Lydia from the School of Fashion, Faculty of Design, LaSalle College of the Arts. Once again, thank you for being here with us on this conference. So I'll be your host and moderator for this session. So it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished plenary speaker, Dr. Lilian CHEE. Thank you for being here. Lilian is an Associate Professor of the Architectural Design and Visual Cultures at the National University of Singapore's Department of Architecture, where she co-leads the Research by Design cluster and serves as Assistant Dean at the College of Design and Engineering. Her research engages at intersections of architecture, affect, domesticity, and visual cultures, with a particular focus on how architecture is experienced, represented, and narrated. So her profile is really amazing, and I really do not want to take up a lot of time introducing her because you can see from her presentation later, but I will do a short introduction what she'll be presenting today. She'll be presenting on Telling Through Encounter, a thought-provoking exploration of architectural writing, affect, and fabulation. She will examine how we tell, how architectural knowledge is shaped when we remain close to the intensity of lived experience. Design is often understood in visual and tactile terms, but Dr. CHEE argues that it is also deeply influences how we narrate and make sense of encounters. She will discuss how the immediacy of experience translates into written discourse and why this process is crucial to architectural thinking. And she will also be sharing and focus on her book on architecture and affect, using it as a lens to illustrate how writing functions as a form of architectural design. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lilian CHEE.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Lydia, for the very clear introduction to my talk. I'd like to thank LaSalle College of the Arts, Dean Hidayah Abu Bakar, Lydia Crispins, and Common Ground Research Networks, specifically Alba Lopez Fahy, who has been, they have been helping me across the last few months, I think. So I am actually speaking today from my position as an architecture academic and working, making, thinking, and teaching in the field. This lecture, Telling Through Encounter, brings together the writing of architecture, the notion of affect, and the role of fabulation. I'm asking that we pay attention to how we tell, specifically what happens to what we know when we stay close to the stickiness of a situation we encounter. I argue that the act of design, frequently perceived as visual and tactile, is equally influenced in what we account for and how we relate to what is experienced. In other words, design is also made in words, in how we communicate, write, and speak of it. I discuss what happens when the immediacy of encounter is transposed into the written form, and why the evidence of encounter is important to hold on to in architectural discourse as well as creative practice. The second half of this talk will focus on my book, Architecture and Affect, which I will employ as a kind of object lesson to think through this idea of writing architecture or writing creative practice as design. In their book, Speculative Everything, Anthony Dune and Fiona Raby emphasize that design is not a problem-solving exercise, but a catalyst for redefining our relationship to reality. Which is to say, design will provide new space to debate and reconsider our entrenched values, belief systems, attitudes, and behaviors. Design is for making us see, think, and imagine anew. Consistent with this context of design as a lens to imagine, see, and think anew, I attend to the historical critically and creatively, often resisting what it silences to rework how an event or a situation could have come into being. This is to say, I use history telling to reconfigure a present so we can think around the what-ifs and what could be. This mode of history telling unsettles the inevitable march of the present, which is always articulated with what is strident in the archives. My writing, design, collaborative drawing, and filmmaking work put forth different kinds of futures, appealing to the individual person in the audience and persuading them to reconsider what matters to them. An important aspect of my methodology involves fabulation, or the telling of stories and histories. I prefer the term fabulation rather than narrative, because fabulation suggests a more layered and critical act of telling, and because how one tells becomes structural to the understanding of a subject, rather than an embellishment secondary to its proper knowledge. I began on this route when I started on my own PhD studies many years ago. Looking into the architectural history of the Raffles Hotel, amongst its official documents and notices, archived architectural drawings, I found 2 newspaper articles about a tiger and several animals gate crashing into the hotel in the early 20th century. Much as I tried to focus on the ledger of archival records, with its important names, deeds, and historical consequences, that intransigent tiger haunted me. Indeed, it was the tiger, called Stripes by the Straits Times reporter, who set me on this emotional trail of fabulation through encounter. Fabulating, writing alongside the circumstances in which we come to encounter a subject, such as my own knowing of the billiard room, through its shifting and uncertain tiger anecdotes, changes the dynamics of this subject, alters its very makeup, and the questions it raises. And practicing writing as a form of design and teaching it to architecture students at NUS, I am aware how writing for design embodies its own language models of tactility, proximity, and criticality. For example, a student needs to make a mental note on a Miro board for a drawing or a detail, which hasn't materialized yet, but exists nonetheless as a persistently nebulous idea in their head. Writing about this nebula, this becoming of a new star, giving it a title, conversing with it through carefully conceived words, becomes the first act of materializing the visual form. The first instance where idea and substance coalesce. The text here, sometimes short and manifesto-like, sometimes a haiku, maybe a series of keywords, quotes or lyrics, precedes the image. It does the important job of outlining as concretely as possible, since words are both specific and expansive, the haziness of an idea. This text is an important first prelude to a design. I draw on the term fabulation as it is used in literature and technoscience texts, chiefly by Saidiya Hartman, Ursula Le Guin, John Berger, and Donna Haraway. In Berger's final book titled Confabulations, he tells us we read in order to reach, to touch the vision or experience that prompted the text to approximate what he calls an almost wordless thing that sits behind this text. While Berger here is describing the act of translation between 2 languages and a striving towards the author's intentionality, the description rings true for writing as design, which is writing as a relay between an idea and its becoming into visual and tactile form. Furthermore, confabulation, defined as a neurological disorder resulting in embellishment of a story, is a creative telling to repair the gaps between remembering and forgetting. It is reparation which creates new knowledge, which brings us to a new frontier towards an original manifestation. In her seminal article, Venus in 2 Acts, Saidiya Hartman cites Lisa Lowe's argument of how creative practice can repair and bring into relief a temporal dimension of the what-if. The what-if is a conditional space where there can be, quote, productive attention to the scene of loss, a thinking with twofold attention that seeks to encompass at once the positive objects and methods of history and social science, and the matters absent, entangled, and unavailable by its methods. This is a history, as Hartman says, written with and against the archive. The trade-off, and there is always one, to this kind of history telling is that we have to be ready to experience both hope and defeat, and a sense that we will feel both recovery as well as loss in the values and beliefs we are invested in. What does it mean to do research as rather than about architecture? In other words, if an art historian uses methodologies specific to their discipline to write about their art subjects, what would an architecture academic use as their methodology? My own intellectual labor has been invested in developing epistemic and modes of thinking, making, and writing that approximate a design training with its specifically unwieldy epistemology. That is to say, I try to stay very close and work alongside how we know what we know, through a non-linear design frame marked by discoveries as much as by detours. This mode of knowing, I emphasize, is not the same as saying that someone trained in architecture should be thinking, making, and writing solely about buildings and cities, or drawing methods. What I allude to here is the designer's tendencies to work alongside their encounters. So I'm asking how the epistemic structure of design is first struggle with a sticky encounter, the coming to terms with what is indelible about this encounter, and finding creative ways to articulate the encounter to representation, to drawing, making, filming, writing, storytelling, comes to bear upon our output, whether it is the making of an object, a film, a drawing, or a text. This is the radical challenge that confronts the enterprise of research by design, or creative practice research, in architecture. An effective, expensive, and intuitive project, which intersects a philosophical academic one, whose logic is mostly deemed unassailable, sequential, and watertight, or in frequently used terms today, evidence-based and data-verified. In the last essay he wrote, former head of history and theory studies at the Architectural Association, Mark Cousins, discussed a similar phenomenon. Cousins described the impossibility of putting into words a drawing or a model that has been made, concluding that there is no agreed language with which to describe architecture. Indeed, in extending Cousins' argument, I would say that the act of design is a relay between what we think and what we make. And in between thinking and making, there is the act of using words, storytelling, history-telling, relating to the scene of loss, telling through design as a situation to return to the encounter which seeded the idea. In a lecture given more than 2 decades before, Cousins spoke about how the perceived weakness of architecture is tendencies to gather disparate things, to make connections where there was none to begin with, to speculate, to risk, to recuperate loss, is in fact its strength. These being the qualities which make architecture distinct. Comparing the creative process of architecture to a strong discipline, for example, law, he reiterates that the latter is so strong that a lawyer is able, or indeed must, separate their feelings for the client and follow the letter of the law. In contrast, architectural knowledge, according to Cousins, is never just a question of a transmission of a set of fixed precepts and concepts. He argues that architecture is akin to what Freud called an impossible profession, in that it cannot be objectively taught nor transmitted, since that knowledge which you need to know is inevitably elastic, uncontained, and crucially dependent on your realization of your own subjectivity to the world, and the constant unfolding of your own unconscious self in relation to this uncertain knowledge. This situation recapitulates a question asked by architectural theorist Mark Linder. How, when, or where does, did, or could architecture make its appearance other than architecture? Linder argues that the discipline of architecture can be made stronger, not weaker, if it can be flexible in its identity when it is exposed to other disciplines, whilst at the same time clarifying what is distinctly at its core. Linder's argument takes architecture neither as object, such as buildings or spaces, nor representation, drawings, diagrams, or models, but as a material discipline that is able to shape-shift and reconfigure itself in relation to other disciplines. While what Cousins and Linder articulate resonate with those who have worked through a design process, Its tenuous nature, whether one calls it the unconscious or the other than architecture, is still deeply unsettling, especially when these positions are posed in relation to higher education institutional protocols and research funding structures. Can it be architectural research if it looks more like art? How do we quantify research if the processes cannot be replicated? Trained in an architectural education model which geared one towards the profession and then gaining a PhD through a more text-based history theory dissertation, my own position about research by design is quite honestly one of ambivalence. I'm drawn to the openness and risks of the design process, how we can make a case for an idea which still holds the immediacy of our own encounter with our subject of study. Yet I also know that this argument may not look the same or sound the same, or be constructed in the same sequence as the discursive arguments I was trained to produce. In fact, to compare these two types of discourse, the more conventional history and theory texts with a creative practice text that coexist with a series of non-textual modalities, including drawings, models, films, installations, and performances, is to undermine the potential of either one. And even while the debates about the value and impact of research by design have been ongoing, and perhaps in some quarters settled for more than 3 decades now, the research models for research by design remain elusive and contested in academia. The definition of research by design inevitably provokes argument, since its alignment is contingent rather than fixed. Is research by design more aligned with the profession, as Christopher Frayling in a 1993 paper published by London's Royal College of Art calls research for design? Is it more aligned to academic research? If so, how does the organic process of design tame itself to adhere to the principles of scientific and social science methods? Or is research by design more aligned with the idealism of a design process, Frayling's definition of researching through design? To these questions, I throw into the mix the conceptualization of research by design along an axis occupied by two seemingly contradictory terms, evidence and intuition. Laurent Ballant advances the role of intuition in essential data gathering, arguing that intuition, rather than being autonomic, is embodied and learned through memory and life experiences. Indeed, intuition is a mode of responding to the world where affect meets history. Unlike norms or laws, intuition requires us to make up our own modes of being. Intuitive intelligence is tacit knowledge, an artful doing, a bodily sensing of something important at hand. It is a commitment to knowing through strategic inexactness. Brian Massumi calls this action thinking, feeling, an immediate understanding of what is underway, what might be coming, and what we are becoming. This is inactive understanding. It is at one with action. Intuitive knowledge derives from the space of the encounter, shaped in transition through acknowledging connection and co-presence. It derives momentum from being in between, from knowing how to glean or how to borrow artfully from other disciplines. Architectural historians Barbara Penner and Charles Rice have questioned what exactly is architectural in the subdiscipline of architectural history. There is an inherent assumption that architectural presupposes particular subjects of study, while not also fully querying whether architectural extends to the specificity of methods and their accompanying forms of evidence. This is also because evidence in academia sometimes is undermined by knowing ahead. Academe is beholden to questions which arrive at the self-same conclusions. Evidence-based inquiry may also mean that the ends justify the means. What if the evidence itself becomes a mode of questioning? The image and text played in loop derive from my book Architecture and Affect, and they reflect on my multiple positions as academic researcher, public intellectual, teacher, and designer. The works make research bear witness to intuition. They attempt to question by evidence. As it happens, quite a lot of what I have worked on is drawn through relationality. That is to say, my encounter with architecture stems from social and interspecies relations. Returning to Cousin's observation about language stuttering in the face of architecture, perhaps it becomes less a struggle, although that struggle never completely goes away, when we let evidence, no matter how disarming, lead. Rather than summon architecture to house the tiger, following the tiger's lead requires a reframing of assumptions and safeguards. For me, it meant questioning my own understanding of post-colonialism and gender, and asking these questions from where I was positioned and who I am. The tiger, the street cat, the single women occupant owners, the graveyard and its denizens, dust and trees are where I start from. These subjects require knowledge to be gathered otherwise. Staying close to the troubles of such delinquent sources and the evidence they point me to also means that I needed to learn to reappraise my own values, to recalibrate what I can and cannot do, and ultimately moved my work closer to architecture's distinctiveness, its shape-shifting ability to recompose in relation to its other. It compelled me to revalue architecture's artful capacity to create anew as witness to an encounter, to be propositional without obliterating that which seeds its creative impulse. Staying with the trouble is the point and price of creative practice research. I move on now to speak on architecture and affect, as an example of writing architecture as design. Affect derives from the Latin noun affectus, something having been affected or influenced, and its verb efficere, to affect or to be affected. Affect is a potential carried by an event or an encounter where something sticks, yet you have no ready vocabulary to explain this sensation. Affect comes into its own when it's played out as a dimension of an event. Hence, to look at architecture through affect requires a looking that is connected to and being in the world. Feminist philosopher Sarah Ahmad writes that affect is what sticks or what sustains or preserves the connections between ideas, values, and objects. To experience an object or architecture as being effective or sensational is to be directed not only toward an object, argues Ahmad, but to whatever is around that object, which includes what is behind the object and the conditions for its arrival. Telling through encounter means accounting for a relation between and to subjects and things, even if these subjects and things stand outside one's own disciplinary ambit. Locating architecture as being in the world, it is not surprising that more than half the actors in this book are non-humans, with their attendant evidence: tigers, cats, trees, ghosts, water, household objects, gravestones. Affect in this book is concerned with visceral and experiential encounters and exchanges between the human and non-human subjects in a spatial setting. It is not just an emotional response to architecture, although that is one aspect. I write about processes, practices, belief systems, situations, atmospheres, feelings, and uncertainties, which are often overlooked in academic writing. Alongside saying what we know, I strive to simultaneously disclose how we know what we know. In effect, writing this book involved constant figuring out of why the effective sticks, what it means, how it is produced, how it circulates, how it works, and why it is so difficult to pin down. My own writing was persistently sabotaged by detours, a constant looping back to retrace missed nuances, prematurely dismissed material, and frustration after frustration as key evidence would not fit an overarching theory. In retrospect, all these roadblocks were hallmarks of working through affect. In particular, it was important to pay attention to and write around the stickiness of affect born through what I call discrepant evidence. By discrepant, I mean unruly, at variance, conflicting, and lacking in appropriateness for architectural scholarship. Like considering Stripes the tiger and his billiard room. Once such evidence is dismissed on the grounds of its discrepancy, gone too are questions and knowledge surrounding them. In writing the account of the billiard room, my task was to follow the tiger's trail. Stripes led me to bestiality and the jungle and colonialist tropes, gendered and racial omissions, the ambivalent tropical fictions of Arundhati Roy and George Orwell, and to the multiple political meanings invested in the figure of a tiger in the tropics. My writing is both meandering and focused. The tiger's associations, emerged through careful design and transitions. And as Hartman says, I wrote with and against the archive. As such, by its detours, by paying heed to murmurs outside the discipline, and in its critical irreverence, architecture and affect may delight some and annoy others. The point of affect to architecture and the argument of my book is that architecture is always in the making, and often by actors outside the discipline. It is our job as scholars to locate and record such making with equal seriousness, despite the subject's discordance with the rules of academia and the discipline. I argue that thinking about architecture through encounter gives us a sense of, quoting from my book, how people belong, how they experience attachment, manage anxiety, hold out hope, and achieve security. In this way, knowing architecture and writing it through encounter is an ethical project. Sticking to stripes, I was shown not just another route through the stories of the billiard room. I was also given another way of seeing and thinking of architecture as one of many modes of knowing in the world. This book is an epistemological experiment of being in the middle and in the midst of situations and things. It acknowledges the scholars, mine and others, manifold relations of being in the world, of their blind spots, the risks that must be taken, who is the scholar is accountable to, and the necessarily unfinished nature of an inquiry which begins with the what if. All these moves challenge the authority, definitiveness, and distant objectivity of academic writing, and acknowledge since it enacts a shift away from academia's tendency to stake territorial boundaries. The tiger is known to many, and thus the text must speak to the multitude. I close with a description about the structure of this book. The 6 text-based chapters in the book are organized in pairs within 3 sections that follow in ascending scale: monument, block, landscape. In each scalar category, a chapter presenting an architectural perspective creates a dialogical symmetry with an extra architectural one looking at a similar space from a visual art or filmic lens. The visual documents are interlocutors, alternative resources and archives holding evidence undervalued in architectural scholarship. And I look at the work particularly here of Simran Gill, the artist, and Charles Lim. Mediating these paired chapters is a section of image essays, which I call the third archive. Hence, each scalar category is conceived as a triadic composition, featuring one architectural voice, one artistic or filmic inflected perspective, and a reciprocal drawing-based discourse. Each chapter additionally opens with a situational drawing of an effective piece of evidence and closes with a worm's eye axonometric of the architecture discussed via the encounter. These visual openings and closings flip between the modes of knowledge, the ephemeral encounter which sticks to our consciousness, and the authoritative eye of the discipline. In this book, I argue that both modes of knowledge are important, tearing with that which sticks while attending to our disciplinary training. In this book, I assume 3 voices or roles: as a scholar writing about a historical present, as designer of the third archive, and as a visual collaborator in the essay film 3 Flats. The triadic composition of the book and of my own roles acknowledge the significance and influence of drawings, photographs, and films, and the productive cross-disciplinary exchanges between architecture and these visual disciplines. These dialogical chapters question how one might understand and express architecture beyond what architecture knows of itself. The third archive, made in collaboration with 3 alumni and ex-students of mine from NUS, Toby Fong, Lin Terong, and Wong Zihao, whom I have great privilege of learning from and working with, is positioned as interludes between the 3 scalar sections of the book, of block, monument, and landscape. It takes what Jennifer Bloomer calls dirty drawings. It takes after what Bloomer calls dirty drawings, which are, quote, technically accurate but improperly ornamental in their imagined existence. Akin to Burgess' confabulations, these drawings and their texts speculate around the gaps in archives and official accounts. They create spaces for subjects that do not yet have a proper place in architecture. Tracing the Last Tiger is constructed in the manner of a long landscape scroll, and ideally read like a detective game or a chase. The 3 scenes are designed around archival newspaper records of tiger sightings in Singapore in the first decade of the 20th century. Combining a trail of objects and archival excerpts, it offers forensic information of the clues left behind by 2 or 3 tigers, the number ultimately never fully verifiable. And Archiving Public Housing is a a graphic novel and infographic drawn around factual and fictional accounts of subversive and not altogether legal acts in the housing block. The tall scroll is crowded with household artifacts and curious practices that make up the weird and wonderful lived experiences of Singaporean public housing. In these 2 drawings, there was a struggle to accentuate the scale of artifacts, the movement and practices of human and non-human actors, all these being rendered invisible in accounts of the block architecturally and the landscape. Holes in the ground are hybrid model drawings with detailed material-based annotations of soil, stone, wood, water, bone, and spirit. They recall the making of the architectural model, those miniature objects which spark curiosity and delight. Except these model drawings speak to the violence of grave exhumations in a land-hungry nation. They relieve the clashes between and incommensurability of 3 space-defining tenets: modern planning norms, folk belief systems, and syncretic religious practices. The 3rd archive may be read by itself or together with the long text chapters. They are dilations into our encounters of the lived world. They are forms of citations and critiques. They enact and materialize spaces and subjectivities for the situations they manifest. And they trace the moving of thought from fact to fiction, history to story, ideas to subject, and vice versa. The drawings and photographs, images, work with the text to emphasize the convenience of architecture, that slow and circuitous process of coming to know, made via detours, distractions, and relays. The images, which are in themselves effective, and as such the vivid colours in the e-book are thus all the more powerful, do not simply say, this is what it is. They carry 3rd meanings, prick one's consciousness, evoke delight, anxiety, or repulsion. Architecture and effect strives to record what we see and sense. The design of this writing is much like a quilt, carefully sewn to connect relational fragments, and often invested in the repairing of gaps and abscesses carried by these fragments. The writing stays close to its subjects and their discrepant evidence. Each chapter makes headway through the subject's specific perspectives and their own arts of knowing, bringing these new modes of knowing to bear upon and indeed stirring up trouble for architectural scholarship. Found in a state of distraction, something else brings us to architecture. This book transports the writing of architecture to the place and immediacy of those eventful encounters. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was an amazing presentation for the morning.